Today on Nation to Nation, Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu on why the federal government is moving ahead on long-term reform in child welfare services with First Nations in Ontario, after it failed to reach an agreement with the Assembly of First Nations.
Chiefs of Ontario and Anishinaabe Nation reached out to me and said, is there a path forward for our region?
And AFN Regional Chief for Ontario Abram Benedict on why his organization believes this is the right move.
And we want to end the discrimination in our region today, not several years down the road.
Polls continue to indicate Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives will form the next government. Toronto Metropolitan University professor Palmater says this spells bad news for Indigenous people.
But if you look at his record and everything he has said in Parliament, it doesn't look good for First Nations in particular and Indigenous women and girls.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. Well, it's been quite a first week of 2025 in Ottawa. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's resignation at the top of the list. Nevertheless, this week, the Liberals announced they will be pursuing an agreement on long-term reform in First Nations child welfare with the Chiefs of Ontario and Anishinaabe Nation. This after a $47.8 billion final settlement agreement on reform for all First Nations failed to pass at the AFN Assembly in Calgary last October. Joining me today to talk about the latest is Minister of Indigenous Services Patty Hajdu. Welcome back to Nation Nation, Mr. Hajdu.
Great to be here.
Right. So I guess that the first question some people have is that you've decided to move forward, of course, with Ontario First Nations basically on this agreement. But why not, sort of go back to the AFN and try to work with them to hammer out a larger agreement for all First Nations in Canada?
Well, first of all, I'd say it's very disappointing that the $48 billion agreement was voted down by some chiefs. Obviously, the majority of chiefs at AFN, but notably the Chiefs of Ontario and Anishinaabe Nation, who had been two of the four litigants in the case that started the work on this agreement. Their membership were in support of the agreement. And after the vote, both chiefs of Ontario, the Chiefs of Ontario and Anishinaabe Nation reached out to me and said, is there a path forward for our region? Because we want to stop litigation with Canada, and we want to honor this work that our members have done and get this agreement with Canada. Obviously, I had to seek a mandate to do that work, and I was successful in receiving that mandate from the Prime Minister. From my sense, it doesn't make sense to look two of the four litigants in the eye and say, well, no, you must continue to sue us. So now all the parties are at the table. It shouldn't be that terribly onerous of a task. They're satisfied with the agreement as it's written. There are a couple aspects that are national in scope that need to be kind of scoped down for Ontario, and they're working through those details now. So this is good news for families in Ontario, for First Nations in Ontario that want to have a reform of the way that child welfare is done, including a focus more predominantly on the prevention pieces that help kids stay at home and in community.
Okay, and just moving back to the $47.8 billion agreement, because I was at the Assembly in Calgary for all of it, it wasn't so much, I think, that the two sides were so far apart. I think there's a lot of questions about process, consultation, that, so they might have not been as far apart. So why not maybe, the AFN again, and they've expressed an interest to negotiate a national deal, so why not, again, sort of approach them as well on that to sort of get a deal for all First Nations?
Well, as you know, there were a series of resolutions coming out of that meeting and in consequent meetings around how best to ensure that their own members felt scoped in. Look, we worked closely with the AFN. The Caring Society, as you know, removed themselves from the process near the end of the negotiations. But we were always there with AFN and with their negotiating partners to make sure that we hammered out a deal. In fact, as you know, the National Chief was very satisfied with the deal before the vote. Her members didn't feel that way, and now they're doing that work of figuring out how they are more inclusive in ensuring that regions' voices are fully scoped in and that their members are fully aware of the scope of the agreement and how these decisions are made. That's the work AFN is doing, and I honor that work. I think it is important work, and I think anyone who leads a large organization knows just how difficult it is to make sure that all voices are included in crafting an arrangement like that. But that doesn't negate the fact that the deep disappointment of the Chiefs of Ontario, Anishinaabe Nation, and they're repeated, by the way, their hard work of going to their members and getting mandates from their members to move forward. That work can't be seen as any less valid. It's very important work. And in fact, as you know, Chief Fiddler tweeted the day after the vote was happened. He said, "This is a good day for child welfare agencies." And what he was, afterwards in consequent conversations with Chief Fiddler, what he relayed to me was, we need to transform the system to where the focus is on children and apprehension and to the prevention piece that I think for him and for the members that he was representing is such a critical ingredient in this reform.
Okay, and so seeing that you're here also, of course, Bill C-61, the First Nations Clean Water Act, of course, Parliament was prorogued on Monday, which means things die in the order paper. So what happens now for these First Nations, of course, that need money and resources to, improve their water systems and get rid of the boil water advisories?
Well, as you know, we've done a ton of work over the last 9 years to lift long-term boil water advisories, and with 31 remaining out of the initial 140 and dozens more short-term prevented from going long-term. But it also provided a way for First Nations to protect the source water that feeds their systems. So many communities have experienced poisoned water. That's not remediated and not remediable in some cases. And the last thing is, this bill would have established a human right to drinking water on First Nations land. Many Canadians don't know this, but in Ontario, you don't have a human right to drinking water. But Canada recognized that with federal Crown land, we actually had the legal authority to establish that right and to put it into law so that future governments couldn't abdicate the responsibility of protecting with First Nations their right to clean drinking water. That's devastating, actually. And so my hope is that the NDP talked a good game about, wanting to get this bill through and yet put up a number of roadblocks even after the AFN and other partners appealed with them to speed up the process. The Conservatives told my colleague Jaime Batiste that they would support the bill with some minor amendments, which we did to clarify provincial jurisdiction, and then voted against sending it to Senate. Devastating, not just MP Batiste, but the First Nations that have worked so hard on this bill. Don't forget this was co-developed. So I think my hope is, and it's a very slim hope, but my hope is that when the Liberal leader is appointed and we come back to the House of Commons, that the NDP will realize that bringing down the House of Commons is going to deeply hurt First Nations. And maybe there'll be a path forward to bring that bill back to the House of Commons. I know our government would certainly support that, and send it off to Senate through a unanimous consent and let that bill pass into law. But failing that, I guess it is in the hands of the next government. And I can tell you, if it's a Conservative government, I guarantee that this bill will not be drafted in the way that it is to protect autonomy, rights, equity, and indeed that water that is life for all of us.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there, but as always, a pleasure, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Up next, we'll talk to AFN Regional Chief for Ontario, Abram Benedict, about why the Chiefs of Ontario are continuing to pursue an agreement on long-term reform in First Nations child welfare with the federal government. Welcome back. As mentioned earlier, a $47.8 billion proposed final settlement agreement on long-term reform of the First Nations child welfare system was rejected by Chiefs at an AFN assembly late last year. However, the agreement was supported by the Chiefs of Ontario and Anishinaabe Nation. They are both now moving ahead to negotiate a separate agreement with the federal government. Joining me today to talk about why his organization is doing this is AFN Regional Chief for Ontario, Abram Benedict. Joins me from Akwesasne, Quebec.
Good morning. Thank you.
Maybe can you first, I guess, tell our viewers why you've decided to move ahead on this agreement and what happens next?
Mhm. Well, I mean, to put a little context in the agreement, the Chiefs of Ontario as well as the Snoqualmie Nation have been interveners in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal for several years now, working through the process of the tribunal and then leading into negotiations of a settlement outside of the tribunal process. And so that process has been happening for a number of years. Actually, it's been on and off. We do know that a draft agreement was concluded and announced at the AFN Assembly last year in July in Montreal, and the announcement was made that there's a tentative agreement. At that time, our leadership reviewed the agreement, which we, as the Chiefs of Ontario, have been involved in negotiating and authoring the draft agreement itself. And so the AFN has been there for the rest of the rest of Canada. We have been there for our region. And so, we brought the draft forward to our leadership at Ontario Assembly, debated it with our leadership, and they accepted it. And then we went off to Calgary and with the AFN and seen that unfortunately was rejected at a national level. And so after that, we went back to our chiefs in our region and had a conversation with them, and they said, well, we're comfortable with this agreement that we have. We want to end discrimination against our children today, not tomorrow. We want to all the elements that we think acknowledges the uniqueness of Ontario is in there, and we want to advance this. And so we received reaffirmed our mandate from our region, and we went to the federal government and said, look, we have this draft agreement here. It talks about national reform, but we're prepared to enter into conversation about regional reform for Ontario. And that's where we're at.
Now, is the agreement, what you'll be negotiating, is it just strictly on long-term reform of child welfare, or will some of the outstanding issues on Jordan's Principle be part of these negotiations?
No, this process that we'll be advancing with Canada and the Snoqualmie Nation is specifically for long-term reform, and the elements that will be in our agreement are already out there. So there's going to be no secrets of what's going to be in our agreements, because it will be all the same elements that are in the draft agreement that all First Nations across Canada have seen, that many technicians have seen. We will only pull out the elements that are not relevant to Ontario, and the $47.8 billion reform over 10 years. We will not be the $47.8 billion agreement for Ontario. It will be the numbers that are appropriate for Ontario that has already been proposed.
Okay, fair enough. Now, at the same time, the federal government also announced earlier this week that it will not be negotiating any further on this issue with the AFN. Do you not see this maybe as perhaps like a divide and conquer sort of tactic by the federal government, which, of course, has not served First Nations in general well over time?
Well, so what the federal government says is they're not prepared to expand their mandate. The AFN as a whole, the Chiefs in Assembly took a look at a draft that they had. It was rejected. They passed it to resolution. Subsequently, another one. Calling on Canada to expand its mandate to meet additional demands for a negotiation. And essentially what Canada has said is they're not prepared to do that. And so, it's not, I'm not sure that it's a divide and conquer. We're prepared to take what has been put forward, which we have helped negotiate as the Chiefs of Ontario already, and advance that for our region. Now, I can tell you that there are other regions that have bilateral agreements with the federal government that other regions don't have, so this is not, specifically in health, there are some bilateral agreements that exist across Canada for First Nations that don't exist in other regions. So this is not something that's all entirely new. We're prepared to transform the child welfare system in Ontario, which is desperately needed. Status quo is not acceptable, and we want to end the discrimination in our region today, not several years down the road. We have a federal government that inevitably is going to change. The process of the tribunal takes years. I mean, this is over 10 years that we've been in this process of the tribunal. Our children cannot wait in our region, and that's the message that my leadership has reaffirmed to me, and that's what we're advancing.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe pick up a little bit on that urgency. We've talked a little bit before, but maybe you could explain to our viewers some of the unique challenges, particularly that First Nations in Ontario face when it comes to child welfare funding.
Well, so the challenge has been around the reform of national reform of child welfare is that as long as the Constitution devolves those responsibilities to the province is going to have the systems in every province is different, and so to think that we can reform nationally a program is a bit problematic. And so because we were part of the negotiations, there's a number of unique elements in Ontario that were negotiated into national reform, such as band rep function. This is a function that's existed in the child welfare systems, First Nations and non-First Nation, for a number of years in Ontario. And if the national reform had been accepted, band rep would have been a program across the nation, and that's a benefit that we had ensured was negotiated into it. The other one is the acknowledgement of northern and remote communities. While we have a number of communities in our region here who are northern remote have very unique circumstances for access. There are other regions that have communities that are very remote as well, not to the same tune that we have here, but those communities would receive additional resources as well. So there's some elements in there that were put into a national reform because of our approach, because of Chiefs of Ontario's demand that it be in there, and those are the elements that we'll have in our regional agreement here. I would say that I'm not certain that the federal government has said that we won't negotiate with other regions. They've said that we're not expanding our mandate to negotiate anything further, and we're taking what has already been proposed.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there, but as always, thanks again for joining us today.
Absolutely, thank you.
Up next, we'll talk to Toronto Metropolitan University Professor Pam Palmater about the legacy of Justin Trudeau and what it means for Indigenous people. Welcome back. This week marked the end of an era. The announcement by Justin Trudeau that he'll be stepping down as Prime Minister once a new Liberal leader is selected. When Trudeau and the Liberals came to office in 2015, he announced his most important relationship is with Indigenous people. Joining me today to talk about what Trudeau's legacy may be as far as Indigenous people are concerned is Metropolitan University of Toronto Professor Pam Palmater. Welcome back to Nation to Nation.
Thanks for having me, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. So I guess the first question is, what do you think Trudeau's legacy will be as far as Indigenous people are concerned?
Well, I think it's going to be a mixed bag. You've got the fact that he rammed through pipelines, kind of tossed free, prior, and informed consent out the window. He hasn't finished with the long-term childcare reform. There's some legislation he didn't get through. He didn't really take substantive action on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. So, you've got that. On the positive side of things, he incorporated or enacted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He actually did have a national inquiry into murdered and missing. He's got numerous settlements with the Inuit, the dog sled shooting, First Nation water, compensation for child and family services on reserve. So he got rid of some of the sex discrimination in the Indian Act. So there's some on the positive. Obviously, there's some on the negative, but I think consistent with every other government since Confederation, no real progress on self-determination, self-government, and also land back. So those two big ticket items, there's never been movement by any government.
Now, certainly a lot of this is new ground. Really, in the past, governments have really only, had a hostile relationship with Indigenous people, and it hasn't been a priority. He's tried to do some things, and certainly I don't think you can accuse him of not being willing to take risks. Do you think, the way things have turned out and the way he left this week, do you think that future governments now on this file are just not going to be willing to make it a priority or take any risks at all?
Yeah, so that's the thing. You really hit it right there, because it is risky to come out and say, hey, I accept the finding of the national inquiry that Canada's engaged in historic and ongoing genocide. We accept that we have been dealing in a racist way, and to engage in a large number of settlements instead of litigation. So that's all very risky, because that always gets the ire of conservatives who are always talking about saving money. I think the other thing too, I don't know if you would put it in the category of risk, but he acted very swiftly on the pandemic, both for Indigenous peoples, in particular First Nations, and Canadians in general, in terms of having health mandates and vaccines and supports, early financial supports, something that the Conservative government said they would never do. And he got highly criticized for that. And there were Freedom Convoy protests. So you take a risk when you realize that there's a large contingency who don't agree with social supports. So again, I don't see, let's just say a Pierre Poilievre government gets in, good grief. He wouldn't be anywhere near that. He's all about mining and pipelines, resource extraction, and really, he won't be engaged in any of these settlements. I think if somehow the Liberals got in, they would, or some kind of Liberal NDP partnership again, they would probably go forward with the same legislative agenda, the same negotiating agenda, that kind of thing. But I think barring that, if it really is a Conservative government, like, we're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, if you read the polls, of course, it'd be a pretty solid Conservative majority if they went to the polls today, and things don't look very good for the Liberals at this particular moment in time. Have you seen anything that gives you maybe, aside from sort of, you mentioned pipelines, economic development, and oil and gas, things like that, from the Conservatives that would maybe say that they would have maybe some more a positive approach than they did perhaps under Prime Minister Harper?
I don't see anything that would be positive. And in fact, I think if you do the political analysis of where Pierre Poilievre and his more right-leaning party, like more far right-leaning members of his party, I think it would be even worse than Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper had some relationships with some First Nations, but under Pierre Poilievre, his entire mantra is Trudeau is awful. Trudeau's responsible for worldwide inflation. And so when it comes to Indigenous issues, you don't see really clear answers. You see him only reference things in terms of natural resources extraction. But if you look at his record and everything he has said in Parliament, it doesn't look good for First Nations in particular and Indigenous women and girls, because they just don't see any of these issues as a problem. We know previously they tried to blame, it's all First Nations chiefs is responsible for poverty in First Nations. And we know that's not the case. So I'm very concerned. You saw the interview he had with, that guy who is the same as him. I don't want to give him any airtime. You see him hanging around with Freedom Convoy folks. You see him, supporting people in the Trump government. So we're not just talking about old school Conservatives. I'd be a little less concerned, still concerned, but we're talking a more far right who are willing to take those kinds of risks and question things like abortion rights for women and things like that. So very concerned. I don't see a clear positive path forward under a Pierre Poilievre Conservative government.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there. But as always, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.